Hello, everyone. Namaste, hola, jambo, ni hao, bonjour. It's wonderful to have everybody from around the world here at Davos Worldwide. We want to thank the leadership team, Anand Singh, and everyone else, Annika, that have prepared this and organized this, assembled this incredible next, sort of version episode of Davos Worldwide, coming hot off the heels around COP30 in Belém and other parts of Brazil. We hope that wherever you may be, you are healthy and safe with your loved ones and making a difference in the world, making the world, your society, our societies, our communities, and the planet better. My name is Dr. Sanjeev Kagram. I have the great honor and privilege of being part of the Davos Worldwide team connected to this incredible organization. I am currently a distinguished visiting fellow at Stanford University, and one of the co-sponsors of this event is an incredible center at Stanford called the Stanford Center for Sustainable Development and Global Competitiveness, led by Dr. Mike Lepic, a great friend and brother, a great leader and academic. And so that is institute on behalf of them. We're excited and honored to co-sponsor. Also, am chair of the Leaders on Purpose nonprofit. I think you all know that Leaders on Purpose is an incredible global community advancing purpose-driven leadership, purpose-aligned organizations, and purpose-aligned societies and economies around the world, led by Krista Jory and Tatiana Karnowski, my wonderful sisters. And so they are the focused nonprofit of Davos Worldwide. So I would encourage you, if you have some extra resources, to contribute to that incredible community. Um, I'm also Dean Emeritus and Foundation Professor of Global Leadership at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. Was there for 7 years, very proud of our #1 ranking in international trade, our expansion around the world, the launching of the 100 Million Learners Initiative, and many other aspects. I'll be joining you later on some other panels and sessions. And I see that we have Dr. Monk joining us. I was partly filling time, but also wanting to get a little bit about my background. For those of you who don't know me, though, probably the most important thing to know is that I am obviously of Indian descent, but I was born in Uganda. My family was expelled along with myself in 1972, fourth generation. Lost everything and ended up in refugee camps for many years, and then were response to the United States. We were very blessed. And we know that there's 200 million refugees around the world. We're going to have a refugee session. I'm partly putting a plug in for that later on in Davos Worldwide. But when I think about, and when I got to Stanford as an undergraduate, I was blessed enough to come to Stanford as an undergraduate with a full ride scholarship, transformed my life. As young people, we all think about how did we get where we got and what happened. And certainly for me, that was why did the expulsion happen in Uganda? Why would that happen? And my simple, and I think quite accurate, albeit not complete, answer at the time was that if we had sustainable and inclusive prosperity, then there would have been no need for an expulsion. There would have been no motivation and capacity and capability to do that. So, what we are discussing across Davos Worldwide throughout its history and into the future, but connected to COP30, while we focus, of course, on the COP with climate change and all things environmental, social, economic sustainability, these are all, as we know, intertwined, deeply intertwined. And what's also deeply intertwined is what we do today affects what happens tomorrow, what affects next week, and the months ahead, and the years ahead, and decades, and if not even beyond that. Um, we're building a platform, partly sponsored by Stanford and the Hoover Institution and partners like the Stanford Center on Sustainable Development, but also the World Bank, forecasting country trajectories out into the future. Obviously, we're all worried about the downside risks of AI, and I certainly am. We just had a wonderful session on AI and sustainability, where we brought in lots of great leaders discussing that off the record because it's a challenging topic, the sustainability of AI, AI and sustainability. Um, but when we think about the potential of this remarkable set of technologies to improve humankind and the planet, we're just tapping the tips of that surface. And that's really about the longer term, which leads us to this incredible session, which is about investing for the long term. And by long term, right, Ashby and Camila, we mean very long term. Maybe a lot
Dude.
longer than we might be thinking amongst ourselves, or so the audience might be thinking, whether they're joining us live from around the world or in person. So I just want to do a quick introduction, but I'm going to come to them because I always like to do these sessions, as I was telling Camila, by our panelists, because they're remarkable human beings. Besides the expertise and experience they bring, they have incredible stories. And part of Davos Worldwide is connecting us with one another and our stories. So Dr. Ashby Monk is the founder and leader of the Stanford Long-Term Investment Initiative, which is part of that Stanford Center on Sustainable Development. I'm going to
Yep.
come back to you in a second, Ashby. And then Camila is a leader in SPIN, this incredible global organization advancing investments, capabilities, all sorts of things when it comes to resilience, disaster risk reduction, preparedness, and management, among many other things, which I hope she's going to talk about, as with Ashby. So I'm actually going to start with you, Camila. Tell us, and tell particularly the audience, I have the great privilege of knowing you personally, a little bit about your background, the trajectory that took you to this place of investing into the very long future, being part of investing into the very, very long future of our humanity and our planet. Camila, welcome.
Well, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here. I was very excited, to talk about this. I definitely see the passion and all the work that, has to be done. And it's great to be part of a group that, is like-minded individuals. So I guess I can start a little bit about myself and as you talked about the trajectory and maybe the why, behind some of my motivation to be in the space, but also connecting to, of course, my personal experience. So I'm originally from Colombia, born and raised in Bogota, Colombia. I started with an initial dream of continuing my basketball career in education. I actually played for Colombian national team for a decade. And I always wanted to pursue my athletic career and continue to play Division I basketball in the U.S., which was really kind of my first motivation to continue further my education and my basketball career. Which really led me to pursuing some of that, and going to finish my school in high school in Florida, and then later I attended the George Washington University where I played for 4 years when I was recruited to play there, and really always kind of connecting both worlds. Which I grew up in Colombia where we also had a lot of different disasters, different hazards, and I was really more from a public servant mindset and really wanted to volunteer in the communities. I really had that always in the back of my mind, right? To just professionally, I know I wasn't going to play forever, right? And basketball, of course, I always wanted to continue that. But I always had that in the back of my mind while I was pursuing my undergraduate degree in organizational sciences at GW, and really looking at ways to continue to serve, right? I know we can serve in different ways. We can make a difference in the world in different ways. But after that, and kind of fast forward, as I continue, and really proud of my experience at GW on the team and winning championships. Of course, I would love to talk about all the
Three
sports
championships.
it's always,
Three.
which is always fun, and to talk, my experience as an athlete and the importance of preparation, which I know I'll get to that later, into kind of this industry, right? And preparedness, right? To increase my chances of success on the court, right? And in the classroom, but then later translated into that passion to continue to serve communities to be better prepared, right? For different disasters. So I had a fellowship to also continue my education, got my master's at GW as well in public administration and homeland security and emergency management, while I also have a background in higher education while I served and work at the Office of the President at GW, really focus on student experience, safety, and community on campus, and really looking at how to make sure that universities, as we know, also community is really are prepared. Of course, I cannot tell you, and Dr. Monk as well, I know you're in academia and you can definitely see that as well. And then part of this, I was really working with the Office of Disaster Management as well at the university, and advising the university leadership on that. And then really continue with this journey on the disaster preparedness world, right? And through public administration, which really led me to Spain Global, which it's a public benefit company, where our mission is to disrupt disasters from neighborhoods to nations. So we mainly focus a lot on pre-disaster work. And part of my role at SPIN has been leading our business and industry and global practice areas, really focus on public-private cooperation, and really how can we have more private sector-led initiatives and opportunities to serve our communities, right, through more of a, as we call it, pre-boom, right, and pre-disaster. And also, how can we be more proactive? As we know, it's just everything in sustainability, the risk management, disaster management in the world, not only in the US, of course, but it's very reactive, right? And so really trying to change that culture of preparedness is really some of the work that we do.
But
And more.
Camila, I want to make sure you don't go into the fun yet.
Okay, okay,
Okay, just
cool.
don't go to the fun.
Okay,
Stop
great. Thank
before the
you.
fun.
I'll just stop there. And then just one thing, what else? Another thing I would just add, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Monk as well, is as part of my role at Spin, in the business and industry and global practice area. So I serve as one of the 10 global board members for ARISE, which is the Private Sector Alliance for Disaster Resilience under the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR. And again, really looking at how can the private sector continue to work differently and better, and really how can we make resilience an investable target, right? And then very involved still with higher education and academia. And then last year I got elected to serve on the GW Board of Trustees, which is my two-time alma mater, as I mentioned. So again, really proud to have that other hat that I wear. Still very involved in the sports, world, and I do color commentary on the side for GW Women's Basketball and ESPN, which again, that's a nice fun thing that I do to always kind of be on the court, but I'm not playing anymore, but still supporting. But yeah, I guess that just a little bit about myself and kind of my different worlds, in academia, disaster risk management, and kind of just this world of impact investment, which we'll be talking about a little later. But I'll pause there.
Thank you so much because I don't want to we wanted everyone to get to know this incredible journey you've been on and what has got you with Spin Global and Rise. And then obviously the fun that's going to come. We're going to talk about investing in the long-term future. I will say
Right.
for myself, coming over to Ashby, I have my academic side, but I've also been involved in various different international, global, private sector, public sector activities. Dean of the Desmond Tutu Peace Center, advisor
Yeah.
to Ban Ki-moon, when he was Secretary General, we launched the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, which was the largest SDG 17 partnership launched in 2015. And now, more recently, launched a bank, a community commercial bank, which we're very excited about, the first new community commercial bank in Silicon Valley. Um, and even though it's a very tiny bank, we are always thinking about the long term because we're a minority designated institution, only the third multiracial minority owned bank in the United States. So we're very proud of that, despite the headwinds on those fronts. And the reason I mention this all is that the entire set of folks here, Camila, myself, and now over to Ashby, have these complex, multi-sectoral, global backgrounds that I think gives us a certain perspective and that is very connected to the audience of doubt about the long term. That gives a certain perspective about the long term, obviously experience and expertise to add it. So with that, Ashby, without further ado, please
Sure.
share your story and because it is a very, you know, beautiful story and how we got to the current day of what you're doing at Stanford.
Yeah, sure. It's great to be here. I feel almost obliged to pick up the athletic theme in this session. I was also an NCAA athlete about 2 centuries ago, speaking about time. But you can see my little rowing boat from Princeton right up there. And I also won 2 national championships. So we've got 3 national championships or something on this. There's many national championships, but it
Five,
was
4 or 5.
five. Yeah, that's right. Five. Yeah. So I study long-term investors, and they're this strange animal in the economic fabric because they actually don't exist for purely economic reasons. They exist for social reasons. In fact, that's why governments provide tax subsidies and all kinds of incentives to establish these trusts, whether they're pensions or endowments or foundations or even insurance companies. These organizations exist for some social reason, and those social reasons can extend quite literally 100 years into the future. So if you're a teacher at CalSTRS today, which is the California State Teachers Retirement System, if you're a 22-year-old teacher and you just got tenure, imagine that teacher, she lives to, old age, but around 82, she remarries. a young man of age 25, there's a spousal benefit that could exist for 150 years that that pension fund would owe. And it would be the fiduciary duty of the organization to think about what could prevent that pension fund from paying the pension 150 years from now. And that is like a time machine for the capitalist system. We have to think about the threats to those liabilities. And that's really the project that's kind of defined my life, which is to say, we have $140 trillion sitting in pension funds and sovereign funds. It's looking way out into the future. It's made social
Ashby, could I
progress.
just pause you? I just
Yeah.
want everybody to remember that number,
Oh, yeah.
$140 trillion dollars.
I
I
know.
just,
It's a big one.
I think people don't remember or recognize or internalize what we're talking about. Back to you,
I
Ashby.
know. I wish I had like a good stat. Like if you stacked it up as dollar bills, it would go around the moon or something.
We need many of those. Yes.
It's a big number. Global GDP is only about 100 trillion. The global market capitalization of the stock market is only about 100 trillion. So when you say 140 trillion, you're really talking about most of the risk capital in the capitalist system. And it's the base. So the pension funds, they give their capital to the managers many times. And so we often, when I'm teaching undergrads, and I'm like, are you interested in the investment industry? Their mind goes to venture capital, it goes to private equity, it goes to, hedge funds. But those are just intermediaries. The real owners of that investment capital are the endowments, the family offices, the insurance companies that are really serving a social purpose. And so the work I do at Stanford is to bring a deeper understanding of how to shape that 140 trillion and where it goes. Most of the students that walk into my class, they have some big problem they want to solve in the world. They want to, create better jobs. They want to prevent climate change. You name it, right? Which is another way of saying they want to move that $140 trillion dollars into things they care about. Less hedge funds, more climate solutions. And so it's my job to explain to them how you actually do move it because it's possible, but you need to know the language of the long-term investors to move that money.
So let me follow up with a question to help you, take it forward if you're okay with that.
Sure, let's do it.
Um, You talk to a lot of these folks, Ashby.
Yeah,
Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, of course, here in the United States, we're watching, uh, Prince Mohammed bin Salman meet
yeah,
our President Trump. Uh, President Trump announced a new American sovereign wealth fund.
that's right.
Obviously, we have some pretty major long-term investment funds in Saudi Arabia, and you
Yeah,
talk to all of these people.
I do.
Uh, how do they see the world as it's in this world that some of us, as you know, we call it, a lot of us, the poly crisis, geopolitical and geoeconomic tensions, accelerating sustainability challenges of all kinds, pushing all sorts of planetary, 7 out of the 9 planetary, you know, technological disruptions, accelerating, intensifying, that's the world we live in. So when you're talking to these long-term investors, and these institutions. Obviously,
Mm.
it's not, there are institutions, they're not just individual, but still, at the end, it's individuals making decisions. How do they see the world? And obviously, that's going to, I'm sure there's not just a singular view, but what do they say to you? What are they worried about? What are they thinking about? How are they looking at what their mandate, their fiduciary responsibility?
You can think of the job of every investor as basically fortune telling. I mean, to simplify it down, like you're trying to think about where you are now and how you are going to get to this point in the future. And the point in the future, if you're an investment organization, is generally paying a pension, funding a university. You mentioned the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia at the White House. There's $1 trillion sovereign fund in Saudi Arabia called the Public Investment Fund. That organization has for mandate to diversify Saudi Arabia into non-fossil fuel industries. In fact, the Crown Prince has even said he has an ambition for Saudi Arabia to be net zero by 2060. So the economy that we would link most directly in our brains to fossil fuels is trying to use their sovereign fund to get off fossil fuels. incredibly ambitious, and the things they're doing with that sovereign fund are really groundbreaking and unique. Um, it'll take a little time to figure out exactly if it's all working, but I think we can at the very least say it's ambitious and unique. But again, all of these things are about the future. So what future state do you want? Do you want to secure a pension liability, or do you want to diversify an economy? So most of these organizations, they spend a huge amount of time thinking about scenarios, capital market assumptions, projections. They're discounting cash flows from the future. This is all about understanding the future relative to today. And so you can almost think of the job of an investor as futurist. Um, I don't know if that is actually a degree we give at Stanford, but it probably should be.
Well, I want to come back to you on some other examples, but I want to bring in
Cool.
Camila. So, Camila, you're, as you shared, and I know, been involved in the disasters world. Let's put it that way. Everything from anticipating them to trying to prevent them when that's possible. Sometimes they're not, to minimizing their damage, to being able to manage them longer term. Um, how does that fit with long-term investing? Someone might say, we've got Quake Alert, 8 seconds. I don't know how we actually invest in the long term of this stuff. So explain to folks, how do we invest? And particularly, as you said, harness the private sector and public sector to invest long term in disaster management.
Yeah, I continue to ask this actually all the time, to be honest. It's how to make sure that everyone is aligned with the messaging, and I think it's tough from a cultural standpoint. And like I mentioned earlier briefly about being reactive, right? I think, and we're talking about from the US perspective, it's been a very reactive model in the disaster space, only with, let's say, with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. We talk about funding recovery, right? And then after there's a disaster strikes, and then it's always how do we then pay for recovery, right? And then give money after the fact. Many times communities can't even recover, right? And especially if you have cycles that from hurricane season, this is not just natural hazards, right? We're talking about any other type of disruption from cyber, any other human made. These are different things, and a lot of people just think about the natural disasters or just the natural environment. But part of the challenge in this conversation is that we cannot continue to just give money after the fact, right? And recovery, because similar to what you're saying, even though we cannot prevent a lot of disasters and hazards for them to happen, the data and the numbers really show, and right now they've been changing, of course, that the more that we invest in mitigation, the more that we can save in, damages after the fact. For example, now there's like for $1 invested in mitigation, you can save now is between like maybe $6 to $11, in recovery, or to kind of just mitigate some of the impact. But there's still something not really clicking from a lot of the money that still doesn't go towards mitigation, right? So part of the messages and some of the things that we've been talking about and to shift this mindset is how can we make resilience, and in this space we talk about disasters and you name it, from infrastructure, an investable target, because it is definitely, a win-win when we're really talking about public-private cooperation and looking at the long-term investment, that the more that you do that you continue to have private sector involvement, and it's not just about money, right? But from technical expertise, but really working with the government, with public sectors. We know the government cannot do it alone, especially at scale, what we're trying to do, and with ambitious targets. And we talk about from the UN, and not only from what you're talking about, let's say 2060, 2050. Now there's other initiatives now with the 2030 agenda, right? The Sustainable Development Goals you talk about with the Paris Agreement. Now there's a new initiative for early warning systems for all, then trying to do it by 2027, which again, we're talking is like, hey, that's in 2 years, right? It's just a lot of ambitious targets, but the actual solutions are not necessarily aligned at the scale, or the collaboration is still something that there's so many silos, right? There are a lot of challenges, particularly with understanding the mutually beneficial partnerships that we can continue to scale at that level. So part of that conversation and part of what we try to do and try to disrupt, right, really what the system is, and really show that everyone already a lot, well, beyond the US, a lot of states already have so much debt. I mean, they're broke. They can't, it's not sustainable to continue to have debt instruments, right? Continue to depend on grants, continue to depend bonds. They all have different plays in the kind of ecosystem as we talked about. But part of the things that I've noticed that has been a challenge is to continue to re-educate a lot of folks with understanding the benefits for alternative funding sources, right? And mechanisms that that will continue to help for generations to come, as you talked about, for long term, and not just really looking at the 3 to 5 short term changes that won't really help for our generations to increase economic development, reduce some of the disasters and the risk and the exposure to disasters, but really focus a lot on that social impact as well. And you don't have that when a lot of these folks have been really on survival mode. And I think that's one of the challenges, that also you don't have the capacity, that you can really think bigger. And I think that's part of my role when I've been talking to a lot of these jurisdictions and countries, and really think bigger. Like, what would you need to really come in and change and fix for generations to come some of the issues that you have, and not just looking at the 3 years, right? So I think it's been a very fascinating process, a lot of work to be done. And I'm not saying, I don't know, we'll talk more about the fund in particularly, but it's not just the silver bullet to fix everything, but especially when we talk about that $140 trillion, right? Everyone needs to really be aggressive, and how do we implement
Deployed.
it, and just kind
Yeah.
of the strategy, right? So I don't know if that answered your question, but I
Yes,
just
absolutely. But
want
and I
to
want you to
about.
go straight to the
Mhm.
fund because
Okay.
you've taken a piece of that 140 trillion and
Yes.
you're trying to reallocate it towards this, long-term, longer term resilience. So what's
Okay.
the fund?
I'll talk.
How did
Okay.
it happen? How did it come about? What does it do? What is it going to do?
Yes. Okay. Great. So I'll talk a little bit about the fund. So as I mentioned, with Spin Global, we mainly, we're a public benefit company, and as I mentioned, we really do a lot of consulting work and working. We've worked with over 35 countries now to date, and really involved not only in the UN, from my role, as I mentioned, really looking at the UNDR, and also our CEO also is a NATO civil expert, and we also work with the NATO alliance as well, with like civ mil operations, and really looking at, again, more public-private cooperation, right? And really understanding kind of just how that works. But part of the discussion, I mean, started like 7 years ago, this challenge, particularly because we work with the government as well, with the federal government and, local state jurisdictions as well, with understanding that the scale and what we needed to really solve some of these major issues was not sustainable, that we couldn't, of course, depend on just public, right? And federal funding, especially for disasters, right? So part of the discussion and was about how can we pay for disasters differently, right? And part of the discussion then, in discoveries and really talking to a lot of people, came up, pension funds, and really looking at alignment and really that long-term resilience, right? And saying, well, in the resilience space, maybe with sustainability, disaster, right? And there's so many, you talk about energy, well, infrastructure, et cetera. We need to keep looking at that 20, 30 year and beyond, right? Horizon, and not just a lot of how the system is broken, really looking at sometimes grants that are very hard to access, right? A lot of things that maybe are not as fast, a sense of urgency, and a lot of, again, debt instruments. So long story short, with this conversation, not only because we had it from the private side and really working with the governments as well, and really trying to advise on planning, training exercises and national level assessments, and just really set the conditions to better prepared, is how can we also make resilience an investable target? And then we close a deal with a pension funds custodian that manages some of the largest North American and European pension funds, that, of course, they've been doing this for a while all over the world. But one of the mechanisms that we just created the Community Disaster Resilience Fund, that it just allocates specific funding in the resilient infrastructure space, disaster risk reduction, really focus on three things, social impact, disaster risk reduction, and economic development. So that's kind of our priorities for that kind of trifecta approach for some of the folks that and the investments that we're trying to do. And part of this, the minimum investment for the fund is $100 million up to 50 billion per project or cluster of projects. And so what I was talking about, this conversations and the education piece for the fund, and this is a global fund, it's not just in the US, is to really help folks in jurisdictions think bigger, as I mentioned, because part of this, when you're looking at the investment, there are a few criteria, and I don't want to get too specific, but just general, and I know we can talk a little bit about it, is that there needs to be an investment grade rated entity of minimum, triple B minus or above by Moody's, to can serve as that project guarantor and the backer basically. And a lot of the projects that we're looking for have to have a clear business model, right? And of course we see the feasibility studies, but they have to be revenue generating models. So part of the work that we're doing is really looking at what are those physical and hard assets and infrastructure projects. A lot of the cause of disasters and the intensity continue to rise. And of course, a lot of it is aligned with aging infrastructure, a lot of the issues, of course, that we continue to see, that you need to continue to build, replace, and retrofit a lot of this infrastructure that is aging and that needs to really be up to code and long term, right? And so that's kind of how just that partnership started, to really create that pipeline that we're doing right now and really invest in different communities worldwide, and really facilitate some of that investment from backed by
So
public pension funds and to do that. Yep.
it's when I first heard about it, I was like both awed and inspired. But going back to the number 140 trillion, that's a big number. But
Yes.
even going smaller, it's still big. But I just want people to
Right,
realize what you
right,
said,
right.
100 million, right? 100 million per project
Minimum.
minimum, and
Yes.
up to 50 billion, right? Up to 50 billion. What was the 50 billion number?
Yes, up to 50 billion per project or cluster of projects. So this the applications and for the projects that we're trying to invest, they don't just have to be one project that is worth 50, right? Like you can
Yes.
cluster different ones. But like, I mean, of course, when we're looking at this bigger numbers, or maybe 100 million, some may have a 10 million here, you want to scale, right? Or five here, and like, but the majority of the projects have to be revenue generating. But one of the things that we talked about is funding positions in the disaster management space, that you don't have to depend on very restrictive funds, for example, with grants that maybe 3 to 5 years or 2 years, and then after maybe you don't have
Right.
funded positions or stat, right? Or for example, how to give more agency to communities, that they can decide, of course, who do they want to work with, what type of projects and things, that they can cluster different things, that they don't just have to be in one space, but to really imagine, right, a world that they say this is how much we need. And also there are a lot of projects that may not be revenue generating projects, but you could still cluster in the big umbrella of, if there's some training component or if there's something else from education, that it's a lot of flexibility. But of course, the core of it, any utility-based models are always easier, of course, to structure, but we're open and very flexible to help structure what that would look like, to just allow folks and funding. It could take from application to the funds being dispersed into special purpose vehicle, SPV. That is kind of how we go through structuring these deals. It could be 16 weeks from due diligence application, and then the money dispersed into account. So a lot of it's way faster than a lot of government and grants and applications to get.
Faster than a lot of VCs, right, Ashby?
And yeah, so I think again, it just is different, and it's a different approach. I know that this is not clearly, with the numbers that you're talking about, is not the silver bullet, everything, and there's still place, of course, to municipal bonds, right, and grants and other instruments that may not be at that scale. But this is part of the conversations, to have a model, right, and a different generative financing model that is not debt, right, and is an equity based
Right. Okay.
instrument, that we're trying to do it. But
But
yeah,
it's
I'm happy to get
transformative,
into more of that.
incredible, transformative.
Yeah.
Incredibly. I want to bring Ashby back in. So, Ashby, you're listening to Camila talk about this
Yeah.
unbelievable. What do you think? How does this jive with all the knowledge you have, all the expertise you have of how these institutions work and all? Because as I understand and I know, you've been trying with a lot of others, but a major leader in trying to bend the curve, so to speak, with these long-term investors to be wiser, to be more effective, be more efficient in terms of sustainability, broadly construed. So how does that look?
Yeah,
How does
I
this
love it.
model
I mean, kudos to you, Sanji, for pulling this together because it feels very well designed. At first, I thought I
that's
was just being
I
thrown
don't have
into
any
the
many,
mix.
many talents, but a bit,
Yeah, no, because a huge amount of our work today is on what we call portfolio resilience. And going back to 2020, 2021, we literally wrote a paper called the Resilience Manifesto because at the time it felt like all people wanted to do is talk about sustainability and love it or hate it. Like we felt like what we called at the time the ESG industrial complex was selling a lot of ratings that weren't really translating into actual sustainability. So I almost like disliked the ESG before the current ESG backlash. And so now I almost feel like I'm back loving ESG, Sanjeev. So because the people that are hating on ESG are hating it for the wrong reason. The reason that I was frustrated with ESG was it wasn't about outcomes. And it wasn't about long horizon performance. It was checking the box on policies. And do you have a policy or don't you? And it's easy to pick policies out of a hat, but it's really hard to understand, how many gigatons of carbon are we removing from the atmosphere? That's a much harder lift than to say, do you have a policy on climate change? That's easy. And so we started working on resilience, and we tried to take a lot of the engineering models around resilience, architecture, construction, even biodiversity, ecosystems, human psychology, and resilience. And what we learned is like the investment industry is failing to actually appreciate what resilience actually is. And they have defined resilience as robustness. So if you hear the term all-weather portfolio, it might inspire a certain hedge fund to think about, but that is actually what they're pursuing is I would define as robustness. They're shrinking the cone of options, and it is incredibly expensive and hard to build a portfolio like that. And so investors were like, this resilience thing, it's not for us. But the truth is, what resilience is actually is recovering from a crisis. It's the recovery post-crisis that is the definition of resilience.
Or the ability, just even the ability to potentially recover post-crisis, right?
Correct. Ability or doing it.
Yeah,
We don't know if you're resilient until we see you in crisis, which is why we put soldiers through such crazy training.
right.
We're trying to see if they're resilient. Okay. If you know all of the future outcomes, you can put a tank on the ground. If you don't know the future outcomes, you might need to climb a tree, you might need to swim underwater. You can't put a tank on the ground. And so you need these resilient human beings. Sorry to make this about military, but military resilience pops up in the literature quite a bit. And so we've been thinking an awful lot about resilience and how you build resilience. And I promise I'm going to come to Camila in a second and say a lot of what we've learned is you need innovation, creativity, you need early detection, you need to be able to absorb the shock, recover from the shock, and then learn. And all of this is about adaptation, okay? Adapting to unknown environments in the future. Now, the investment industry is quite bad at adaptation and, frankly, innovation. Most of the governing rules that sit on top of these funds actually see innovation as a bad thing. We say if we're a big public pension fund, we only invest in third-time funds. We only invest in funds above a certain size because we're allergic to failure. Well, there's no such thing as innovation without failure, in my experience. And so we are really constraining innovation. But the way that best practices emerge around the industry is not from academics like me writing a new theoretical model, it's through role models. So investors look at their peers and they look at entrepreneurial people like Camilla and they say, is that working? And then they copy. They copy everywhere. This is why you're hearing about the endowment model, the Canadian model. People are copying successful models in order to drive higher performance. So if you want to combine sustainability, resilience into the future of the investment industry, you need entrepreneurial investors to go out and do it well enough that people copy it. And so that's a lot of the work we do, which is to say, how do we invent new models of investment that are resilient, sustainable, environmentally conscious, that other people want to copy? And as you might imagine, investors only copy stuff that are high performing. So you have to generate high performance. So Camila, I'm voting for you to be a top decile manager so that we can have
Not
a,
only vote, you can help. I'm sure she's saying, "Come on, help us
yeah,
out."
we'll help you.
I love it.
Yeah.
That's it. I'm glad I mentioned now. I've been looking at all your work and I have to read all your books now. I think we're aligned with
So
your but you're talking now, of course, tech and the role now into long-term investment. I know you're talking about that, some of that, and that will look. So yeah, this we can definitely continue the
Yeah,
conversation. What that
that's
looks
the whole
like.
point of this, to continue. Obviously, amongst the two of you, that was part of it, but also to get others engaged. Ashby, just for again, for those, we have a full range of folks in Davos worldwide and lots of different types of expertise.
Mhm.
The results part, both you and Camille, I'm going to start with you and then go back to Camille in terms of the
Sure.
results of your fund. What does results mean for long-term investors now? How is it changing?
So we as an industry focus too much on short-term investment return. And we misdiagnose or we misapply short-term returns as goals. So if you go to long-term investors like the big public pensions, they will tell you that their goal is to generate a certain expected return on an annual basis. And I have to remind them, actually, their goal is to pay a pension to a person. And we've simply created this intermediate goal because we didn't have the technology, the data, the systems to guide an investment through to the destination without this like intermediate stop, you know? It's like when you were navigating in the car, you'd be like, I know I need to get to the 101 freeway. And then from there, I know I need to get to San Francisco. Then I cross the Gate Bridge. And so your mind right now is getting to 101, and then you'll figure out the rest later. That's kind of the way our pensions have been operating. But as the tech is getting better and we're seeing more outcomes, not only can we invent new intermediate milestones, so instead of just saying you have to be at a 7.1%, with this certain tracking error, we can start to say, well, look, if we're seeing these other inputs, whether it's knowledge inputs, jobs created, you name it, impact metrics can now be linked to long horizon performance, especially in concert with portfolio metrics like cash flows, volatility, all those kinds of good stuff that are more traditional. And so I don't have a perfect answer for you, Sanjeev, just because every investor is different. We're
Yeah.
seeing unique metrics making their way in.
Yeah.
But the AI moment is allowing for this mass customization of metrics that better link to your long-term goal. And every investor has a slightly different goal, in part because they're all starting from a different place, and every cash flow is unique, right? And so it isn't this like generic portfolio that's being built. Every portfolio has an opportunity to be custom.
That's very helpful. So, I would just say one thing, Camila, because I want to come back to you on this same question as you're thinking about it for the fund for that triangle, the magical triangle. You layer the three, social impact, so forth and so on. But I would just say, much shorter, our little bank, getting people to think when we were starting a de novo bank that we wanted to be involved for the long term. And so you raise $30 million, you want to be a three because you're in a de novo, start a new bank, you become a $300 million bank, but you try to tell investors this is not, you're not, this is not just VC. This is really about we're building a long-term community institution. So we're really thinking about building this bank for 100 years. So that little $30 million that we start with, little in the $140 trillion pie, that becomes 300 million. With it, then you add a little more, becomes a billion, becomes and so forth and so on. It can have, it depending on the bank having the right priorities and values, a huge impact on communities in the way we want to do it. And so to get people to think that way, even in this micro set, it's such a hard thing to do. So that's why I want to come, that's why I'm asking this question, Camila. And so how did you get people to think
Mhm.
in this world of disasters where again it is such a reactive
Right,
after the
right.
fact recovery focus to think long term, and what were the results that they were looking for and you're looking for? What are the results of the fund?
Yeah, no, I know I'm speaking for this particular mechanism. I know it as Ashby talked about as maybe as a whole does not really look the mindset. And I think this is why it took a lot of years of discussions and convincing, especially for this mechanism, because we've actually seen a lot of folks, not only let's say in the US after the California wildfires, right? And some folks that were really trying to launch different funds and then, like the Delta Fund, and there's another resilience fund, but a lot of them they're trying to now fundraise for it, right? So we already have the capital ready to go. If some of the projects are online, as I mentioned, with the minimum, some of the criteria in terms of investment grade entity, business plan or feasibility study. But part of that, which I think this is why I'm very excited about this new funding mechanism, and with the buy-in that we have with the fund custodian and with some of these pension funds to allocate, particularly, to this community disaster resilience fund, is that it's just beyond the ROI, the pension standard ROI from dollars, as we're talking about, and just saying, of course, they need to look at that long-term return on investment, and from that co-ownership model, and how are we going to serve our pension, contributors, and the fund manager, where are we going to invest, et cetera. Okay, great. But part of our role and what we're trying to push for is also understanding the bigger picture, and also the public benefit, which we are a public benefit company, right? And we're looking at what this also means in communities that historically have been, underserved communities, the ones that are maybe in areas that are more prone to different disasters from, floods, and different areas that you're building homes there, and just looking at their impact long term. So we actually also created a public benefit ROI that we look for, in addition to just the standard, 4 to 9% ROIs for part of, that the pension funds we were looking for. Looking at, what does that look like from jobs created, really looking at communities that maybe even lives, like we want to reduce needless suffering in for communities, right? And then reducing mortality rates. There are a lot of things in that other side of just, it's not just a financial investment, but you're really looking at how can we help communities for generations to come, right? And so that this is why I think part of our result in looking at that whole life cycle, right, of investment is understanding kind of just that comprehensive structure, and looking at, where are the communities that need them the most, but also there are a lot of ripple effects that we're not just going to discriminate an area that maybe wasn't traditionally, vulnerable, but it will still benefit, from a regional approach, a lot of folks that will continue to increase economic development, but also it will have a lot of ownership in their balance sheet. They will be richer on paper because there's an investment coming with no capital. You're not borrowing any money, and you have co-ownership of that special purpose vehicle, as I mentioned, the SPV, that is co-owned by the fund and whoever it is in the involved, the IGR. So it's kind of twofold, right, from just the financial, but also, I mean, I don't have the model here. Of course, we can talk about it more at some point, with the actual public benefit ROI that we develop at Spin, just looking at different metrics that we look for, as well as we assess, different applications, and different projects. So it's not just a metrics based on like what the KPIs from just a numbers, right, standpoint. But just looking at how can this really be transformational for a lot of communities. And after minimum, one thing I would say is the minimum investment is, 10 years from a timeline standpoint, 10 years up to 35. And looking at just, again, that long-term alignment with the pension funds, which I think is pretty exciting. Again, looking at that sustainability and looking at how can you transform and help communities that then later, when the SPV, if there's a hybrid model, if there's a co-ownership, or if it's a public operation or private, the SPV gets dissolved, and then this will continue to generate revenue for the communities, right? So it's kind of just looking at that. This is not just for 35 years, but hundreds, right, and more. That this kind of just the vision.
It's super exciting because it's you really invented the double bottom line in many ways, right?
Hmm.
You have your private return, ROI, private,
Right,
institutional,
right, right.
right? And you have this public ROI, and you've built this incredible dual hurdle, in some sense, framework to overcome, to then get in these and to advance innovation. Um, can you give us, before I go back to Ashby, you don't, obviously not specifically. If you could give specifics, that's wonderful, but I presume you can. But even one or two maximum examples, Camila, for people, like what kinds of projects you are or could be investing, like so they can feel it in some sense. Are you going to invest, in X, or like, so people get a real sense of what you're investing in.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that too, because one of the main keywords that I always use when talking to folks who are interested is flexibility. And there are just so many, and I don't want to limit, with the amount of just
Yeah.
options and things that looking at infrastructure projects. But some of the examples that I could, provide right now it's, any infrastructure utility-based projects like water, wastewater, energy systems, communications, any like transportation infrastructure development, for example. That is one of them, like buying or like retrofitting, for example, an entire school system, right? That needs to be up to the best code from earthquake or, whatever you may need, that we can buy, retrofit it, and maybe like lease it back. Well, there are just so many models from like a PPP standpoint that we could talk about. You can build or retrofit affordable public and maybe private housing construction examples. Satellite, also when talk about infrastructure, this could also be from space infrastructure. So we're actually have conversations about wildfire detection, earthquakes, an example from satellites, right? I know you're passionate about that and you have some ideas on that. So there are a lot of options to purchase, lease back, and for the renovation of different systems. And, for example, in emergency management, talk about the emergency operations centers, shelters, they call them resilience hubs. How can we make sure to have areas that if something happens and we can send folks there to make sure that they're safe, dorms, etc. So there are a lot of options. I know, again, I mentioned from like early warning systems, from energy systems, right? From utility, education facilities. So these are just a lot of examples, some of that I can think of right now. But again, there are a lot of other options that we can think of. And again, cluster, right? If you have an energy or a transportation, or if there's a bridge that needs to be built, or if there's something from elevating homes because you're in a flood zone area, and then you have another project that you have a hotel that you haven't used and you want to retrofit that hotel and make it affordable housing. Okay, let's do that, right? Like there's a lot of examples of things that you could really think and just innovate and just use that to based on the need, right? And so it's not just one project that needs to be funded. There are a lot of things that you can have an umbrella that we can
Cluster of
cluster to
projects.
create a disaster resilience fund. As an example that we said, that's part of that. That's so you don't have to wait for the government to that you can go and of course right now FEMA is under review, and that's we'll see kind of some of the changes in terms of that. But before that was an example that you have to then activate it if there's an emergency, and then now you could even have your own pool of funds. And then what if you also create an escrow account, and that's another thing that will there's just a lot of things that which I get really excited about that just because of the possibilities. But I know these are just examples. But one thing I would say, and I'll pause here, is anything that is utility based models are always a little bit easier, as I mentioned, to structure because of the revenue
It's so
generating
clear.
model, right? But then everything else you can then add more and open to, of course, exploring what that would look like. But flexibility is the word for this one for sure.
And that for innovation, right, Ashby? So that brings us back to you. And so from resilience to innovation, and innovation is part of resilience around the world, Ashby, and we just have 6 minutes. So I'm going to ask you to do three because I have one very small question to ask each of you at the end before we end. What are some of, you said the Canadian model, this model, what are some of the models that, you're excited about that are like Camila's, I think very exciting, innovative, model? What are some of the other ones that people should be looking at that are out there?
Any model that brings change into how this current system is operating, because let's take a step back and realize that the capital markets have become increasingly short term, and we need long-term capital to go after the big projects that I think are, let's get like maybe a little bit dramatic and say existential. We have existential projects that need to be worked on. And so we need innovation in those capital markets to start pulling money out of hedge funds, no offense to our hedge fund managers, and give it to the long horizon people building in the real economy. We don't need so much money putting a perfect price on every stock in the public equities. We need people focused on the big problems. So the models that I'm interested in are models that kind of shift the way in which pensions, sovereigns, endowments invest. And so emerging models, we've got the technologized model, which is about really using data analytics to model the future. This is the promise of AI.
Uh,
We have a resilient model, which is really trying to understand how you build holistic health in a portfolio and think about long horizon recoveries. There's the Saudi model, which is the PIF model. Can you imagine a sovereign wealth fund that has started over 100 companies from scratch?
Yeah. Well,
Like,
it started and infusing to scale them in an exponential
I
speed.
know it's pretty wild. And then there's another one called the collaborative model, which is peer organizations, pension funds, sovereign funds coming together to experiment together. All of these are really material innovations in the world of asset owners that could redirect a lot of capital. And my last thought here is to say, if you can change how one pension fund invests, one, you can move billions of dollars. If that change leads to high performance and everybody copies that pension fund, you can move trillions of dollars. And so that's a really simple way of thinking about the work I do.
Well, and the curve that could be bended. So here's the final question. Start with you, Ashby, and then we'll wrap up with you, Camila.
Sure.
If you had a magic wand and you could change one thing right now in long-term investing, and it would really make a big difference, what would you do with your magic wand?
Oh my goodness. My magic wand would be to build a GPS equivalent for every portfolio in the world. Let's call it a portfolio positioning system, because most investors don't actually know what they own. And so if you looked at specifically what are the risks, cash flows, products, et cetera, that I own, I almost guarantee you would say, I didn't realize I owned that in that way with those risks, and you would start to change. And so that's
GPS,
my
that's a great magic wand. Camila, you have the magic wand. It's passed over. One thing, your magic wand. Yes, do it up.
Wow, I wish I could do a lot of things, but I guess we're talking about the
One thing.
space.
Yeah.
Um, I would I would shift the default mindset from grants and debt to equity and shared ownership. So I would want to like everyone change that, chip basically and say, imagine if we stop asking who's going to pay for this and started asking instead, how do we share the value this will generate? Um, that's the mindset shift that I think we need to mainstream some of this climate equity finance. Particularly, I know we're talking about COP right now, and some of the from Baku now to Brazil, that they're being asked to mobilize right now. There's like 1.3 trillion per year in external finance for developing countries by 2035. So of course, to do that, we have to go beyond traditional tools. So I know I talked a lot about some of that mindset and the education and changing some of that culture of preparedness and everything else. So I think that would be something that I would want to change. So everyone.
Well, I'm
Yeah.
so grateful to both of you. I do believe there's an amazing partnership that was part of the design here between the two of you and your institutions, our institutions. I feel like I'm connected to both. And I hope that our audience that is listening, in real time and then, listens maybe on recording, recognizing this huge opportunity with all the challenges that Ashby and Camila have shared, but this critical long-term investing lever that if we don't get right, we need the existential fund, right, Ashby? The
existential projects, we're calling
yeah.
it. Yeah,
And I
yeah,
think
yeah.
I would just end with we want the thriving fund, the long-term thriving fund. We all want to thrive as humans, as societies, as ecosystems, as a planet. So thank you for your leadership, both of you. And thank you to Davos Worldwide for making this possible. All the best. Stay healthy, and everyone. Stay healthy and safe.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Well, thank you, Camila. Thank you.
Yay.
You're awesome. You are the best. I'm gonna connect you and Ashby. He's one of my greatest colleagues over at Stanford. And when you were talking about what you're doing, I was like, this is like, it just adds also to the case, right? They can make this into a case, but you could get a lot, they have a lot of expertise and you're
Hmm.
already doing great. You don't need anybody else, but I'll connect you
Oh my
guys.
goodness. No, the more we have our
No, these
partners.
guys they're really, I mean, really, and guys and gals, they are the best in the world in my view on long-term investing. And so when
I
you
love
talk
it.
about
No,
your
I
model,
already
I was
understood
like,
some of it. Yeah, I was reading some of the work and I was like, this is literally what we talk about, and especially since that's what they do from research and
yeah.
everything else. And so it's
Yeah, I mean,
pretty
I
cool.
think I would like to work on them with you on a case, a set of cases, right? Teaching cases and stuff like that, so we can really
Exactly.
popularize this mind. Because your thing about a mindset shift, that's
Yes,
that's the education piece that we're all believe in, right? As well
I
as
know.
the impact piece, right? I know you know.
And
So
it's been so hard, to be honest, because it's always the going back to what you know, and it's hard
yes,
to change. And sometimes with seeing another model. So no, I would love to continue, of course. And thank you again for the introduction and for connecting us and for the
absolutely.
opportunity to talk a little bit more about
And by the
what.
way, there's a lot of family offices that are listening to this, a lots and lots,
Yeah,
thanks to what Anand, who's, the visual, you see the picture here has set up. So there'll be lots of interest. There'll be lots of interest. Okay.
absolutely. Well, we'll
Okay.
love to continue. Thank you so much, and
And
have
I'm
a great.
setting up a conversation with Ayana Terra. That's the name of the company that
Oh,
Anand,
cool.
yeah, so okay.
Awesome.
All
Okay.
right.
Well,
All right.
thank you.
All right.
Have a good
Okay.
one.